Hi, Bears. Happy Friday. Happy start to a long weekend. And welcome to October. So, as we enter spooky season, I thought it would be appropriate to start reading some spookier kinds of books. And one that I want to share with you today is an oldie but a goodie. And Mrs. Heckman this week reminded me about it. It's called A Tale Dark and Grim by Adam Gidwitz. And it's variations of some of Grimm's fairy tales, but the dark, gory parts of Grimm's fairy tales. And so Adam Gidwitz writes with some humor, but also some gore and some blood and different things than what Disney versions of the Grimm's fairy tales that some of us might know. So this was on the Rebecca Caudle nominated list a long time ago, several years ago. It's in our fantasy section because fairy tales are in the fantasy section. So look for it there. It is the first in a series of Tales Dark and Grim. And he starts out before the first chapter even begins. He says, "Read on if you dare. As for this next story, it is really dark. Frightening things happen. You may feel upset. I'm talking to the big kids now. And as for the little ones, if they are still around, I warn you, I plead with you, make them go away. Don't let them hear this story. They may have nightmares. No, they will have nightmares. At least read it yourself first. Then, if you think they can take it, maybe you can read it to them. And then you have only yourself to blame if they can't sleep for a week." A Tale Dark and Grim. Once upon a time, fairy tales were awesome. I know, you don't believe me. I don't blame you. A little while ago, I wouldn't have believed it myself. Little girls in red caps skipping around the forest? Awesome? I don't think so. But then I started to read them, the real grim ones. Very few little girls in red caps, and those, well, there's one, but she gets eaten. Okay, you're probably saying, if fairy tales are awesome, why are all the ones I've heard so unbelievably mind-numbingly boring? You know how it is with stories. Someone tells a story, then somebody repeats it and it changes. Someone else repeats it and it changes again. Then someone's telling it to their kid and taking out all the scary, bloody scenes. In other words, the awesome parts. And the next thing you know, the story's about an adorable little girl in a red cap skipping through the forest to take cookies to her granny. And you're so bored you've passed out on the floor. The real grim stories are not like that. Take Hansel and Gretel, for example. Two greedy little children try to eat a witch's house, so she decides to cook and eat them instead. Which is fair, it seems to me. But before she can follow through on her perfectly reasonable plan, they lock her in an oven and bake her to death. Which is pretty cool, you have to admit. But maybe it's not awesome. Except, and here's the thing, that's not the real story of Hansel and Gretel. You see, there's another story in Grimm's fairy tales, a story that winds all throughout that moldy, mysterious tome, like a trail of breadcrumbs winding through a forest. It appears in tales you may never have heard, like Faithful Johannes and Brother and Sister. And in some that you have, Hansel and Gretel, for instance. It is the story of two children, a girl named Gretel and a boy named Hansel, traveling through a magical and terrifying world. It is the story of two children striving and failing and then not failing. It is the story of two children finding out the meanings of things. Before I go on, a word of warning. Grimm stories, the ones that weren't changed for little kids, are violent and bloody. And what you're going to hear now, the one true tale in the Tales of Grimm, is as violent and bloody as you can imagine. Really. So if such things bother you, we should probably stop right now. You see, the land of Grimm can be a harrowing place, but it is worth exploring. For in life, it is in the darkest zones one finds the brightest beauty and the most luminous wisdom. And of course, the most blood. Faithful Johannes. Once upon a time, in a kingdom called Grimm, an old king lay on his deathbed. He was Hansel and Gretel's grandfather, but he didn't know that, for neither Hansel nor Gretel had been born yet. Now hold on a minute. I know what you're thinking. I am well aware that nobody wants to hear a story that happens before the main characters show up. Stories like that are boring because they all end exactly the same way, with the main characters showing up. But don't worry, this story is like no story you've ever heard. You see, Hansel and Gretel don't just show up at the end of the story, they show up, and then they get their heads cut off. Just thought you'd like to know. The old king knew he was soon to pass from this world, and so he called for his oldest and most faithful servant. The servant's name was Johannes, but he had served the king's father and his father's father and his father's father's father so loyally that all called him Faithful Johannes. Johannes tottered in on bowed legs, heaving his crooked back step by step and leering with his one good eye. His long nose sniffed at the air. His mouth puckered around two rotten teeth. But despite his grotesque appearance, when he came within view, the old king smiled and said, "Ah, Johannes," and drew him near. The king's voice was weak as he said, "I am soon to die, but before I go, you must promise me two things. First, promise that you will be as faithful to my young son as you have been to me." Without hesitation, Johannes promised. The old king went on. "Second, promise that you will show him his entire inheritance, the castle, the treasures, all this fine land, except for one room. Do not show him the room with the portrait of the golden princess. For if he sees the portrait, he will fall madly in love with her, and I fear it will cost him his life." The king gripped Johannes's hand. "Promise me." Again, Johannes promised. Then the wrinkles of worry left the king's brow, and he closed his eyes and breathed his last. Soon the prince was crowned as the new king. He was celebrated with parades and toasts and feasts all throughout the kingdom. But when the revelry finally abated, Johannes sat him down for a talk. First, Johannes described to him all of the responsibilities of the throne. The young king tried not to fall asleep. Then he explained that the old king had asked him to show the young king his entire inheritance, the castle, the treasures, all this fine land. At the word treasures, the young king's face lit up. Not that he was greedy, it was just that he found the idea of treasures exciting. Finally, Johannes tried to explain his own role to the young king. "I have served your father and your father's father and your father's father's father before that," Johannes said. The young king started calculating on his fingers how that was even possible, but before he could get very far, Johannes had moved on. "They call me Faithful Johannes because I have devoted my life to the kings of Grimm, to helping them, to advising them, to understanding them." "Understanding them?" the young king asked. "No, understanding them, in the ancient sense of the word, standing beneath them, supporting them, bearing their troubles and their pains on my shoulders." The young king thought about this. "So you will understand me too?" he asked. "I will. No matter what? Under any circumstances, that is what being faithful means." "Well, understand that I am tired of this and would like to see the treasures now." And the young king stood up. Faithful Johannes shook his head and sighed. They began by exploring every inch of the castle, the treasure crypts, the towers, and every single room. Every single room, that is, save one. One room remained locked, no matter how many times they passed it. Well, the young king was no fool. He noticed this, and so he asked, "Why is it, Johannes, that you show me every room in the palace, but never this room?" Johannes squinted his one good eye and curled up his puckered, two-toothed mouth. Then he said, "Your father asked me not to show you that room, your highness. He feared it might cost you your life." I'm sorry. I need to stop for a moment. I don't know what you're thinking right now, but when I first heard this part of the story, I thought, what? Is he crazy? Maybe you know something about young people, and maybe you don't. I, having been one myself once upon a time, know a few things about them. And one thing I know is that if you don't want one to do something, for example, go into a room where there's a portrait of an unbearably beautiful princess, saying it might cost you your life is about the worst thing you could possibly say, because then that's all that young person will want to do. I mean, why didn't Johannes say something else? Like, "It's a broom closet." Why? You want to see a broom closet? Or, "It's a fake door, silly, for decoration." Or even, "It's the ladies' bathroom, your majesty. Best not go poking your head in there." Any of those would have been perfectly sufficient as far as I can tell. But he didn't say any of those things. If he had, none of the horrible, bloody events to follow would ever have happened. Well, in that case, I guess I'm glad he told the truth. So it continues on, the story of the faithful Johannes and the locked room, and perhaps some blood and gore, but you'll have to find out for yourself as Hansel and Gretel come out of their story and weave their way through a bunch of other Grimm's fairy tales. So Tale Dark and Grimm, part 1 of a series, and it's, I think, a great way to start the spooky holiday season. Have a great weekend, everybody. Enjoy your day off on Monday, and celebrate it by reading a book. Bye-bye.